Ben, we talk about the happy-go-lucky, loved his Xbox, loved Man United. He was sort of the crash ball centre. And going back, it was the 29th of January 2011. He had phoned me the night before, sort of worried about the game, and I said, just go out and play your game, you know. Normally, if he didn't win, he wouldn't phone me, and if he won, he would phone me as soon as the match was over. I didn't hear anything for a while, and then I got a missed phone call, and then another missed phone call, and I picked up to be told, you know, Ben's been knocked out. And I thought, it's part of rugby, he'll come round, he'll be fine. And then more phone calls saying he still hasn't come round here, he's in an ambulance on the way. So basically, I booked a ticket and flew back. It's probably the longest wait of my life to get over. And at that stage, he was in the Royal Victoria Hospital, and I met the consultants coming down the corridor, and I could just tell. Could tell by the look in their face. And unfortunately for us, 2 days later, he was pronounced dead. You know, it's like I always say, don't give concussion a second chance, you know, because it will wipe you out.
You know, there's definitely that element of risk to a game of rugby whenever you step across the line, whether it's in a training capacity or in a match. You've got that fear, you know, that fear of the unknown, of the unexpected, and injury is part of that. So I've always embraced that and actually sort of gone in with mentality that actually I don't want to be the one that comes off injured, so, you know, I need to be the one doing the injury.
It's quite a physical sport, quite combative, which I quite enjoy as well. But I think the bonds you sort of make when you're sort of putting your body on the line, there's something quite special about the sport.
As soon as I could walk and run, I just loved tackling things, hitting things, wrestling with my dad. And when I was on the pitch, it was the exact same. I relish contact. I loved hitting things as hard as I could in a fair way. Luckily, I never really got penalised for doing anything, because that's what I loved about rugby, is you go out and you go around hitting things as hard as you could, and it was part of the game, and it was legal, and it was actually encouraged.
I played soccer, you know, all throughout my youth, and as I got bigger, I used to tackle people, and I used to get a lot of cards. So I went out and played rugby, and everything that I was doing on the soccer field, but obviously with my shoulders, tackling and kind of playing a game that was a bit more rough and tumble than soccer. Guys were patting me on the back saying, this is great, you know, keep doing that, you know, you're doing really, really well. And I said, wow, man, this is the sport for me. I'm allowed to, you get to fight a little bit, you get to tackle people, you get to run with the ball, you know, you get to do all those things that a young kind of rambunctious kid loves to do, and you get rewarded for it.
You know, people play rugby because they love the game, they love that physical side and physical nature of the game. And at the end of the day, when you do decide to play the sport, you do have to accept there is an element of risk in having an injury in the sport, and unfortunately sometimes a risk of having a serious injury. And you know, that's the nature of the game, and all we can do is make it as safe as we possibly can. There's a lot of other things that run more of a risk to a serious injury than rugby does, but the nature of the game does bring that element of risk with it, unfortunately.
The sport's changed a lot in general, but especially the physicality, because like players are bigger, quicker, stronger than I think they've ever been, and I think the sort of collisions you get in are a lot bigger, and as a result, probably the risk involved and the injuries involved are probably becoming more frequent.
I've probably always paid closer attention to injuries in rugby than some, and I couldn't really believe the attrition rates that were coming out of the game once I went into journalism and started talking to players, and because those injuries weren't really being reported that much at the time, it was just amazing to me how many injuries were just tolerated, and I just felt that some of the kind of some of the words and some of the kind of positions that were being taken by the sport's governing bodies were quite different to what I was seeing on the ground, and I was seeing a really obvious and noticeable increase in head injuries, and it really concerned me. In the background of all this was going on the NFL lawsuit, a huge lawsuit that was being paid out to former players suffering dementia, neurodegenerative problems linked to head injuries they'd sustained while they were playing the sport. And I just didn't buy the line that because they wore helmets, their concussions were in some way different to the ones that rugby players were suffering, which I was seeing on a weekly basis, frankly.
I think for me it was something that you sort of just got on with. You didn't really tell anyone about it. If you didn't get up and and play on, it was sort of seen as as you being soft. Particularly back at home where it's all about that collision and trying to be dominant in the contact area. If you got smashed and it was around the head and you got knocked out, you didn't want to show that because it was a sign of weakness.
There's a real culture in rugby of rubbing some dirt on it and just keep on going, because the real problem there is you can't see the injury. If you got a guy with a broken leg in the middle of the field, nobody's going to scream and cry and say, "Oh, he's a tough guy, he can keep going." No, they put him on a cart and they take him away to the hospital. Problem is with a head injury, you can't see what the injury is. So it's even more dangerous because it's almost like a phantom injury. So saying that, "Oh, he's a tough guy, he can keep going." Well, no, that's wrong, because you don't know if there's something actually broken up in your head. You get another impact after a first impact, you get second impact syndrome, and you can die.
So concussion is a word that's horribly misused and is very poorly defined, and there are no real organic objective measures of exactly what a concussion is. And the other thing is people disagree about what a post-concussion is.
It really is the visible manifestation of an event that happens inside the head. That event is either rapid acceleration or rapid deceleration. And during that event, nerve fibers are stretched. And when they're stretched, they tend to recoil. So it's a little bit like an elastic band. When you stretch an elastic band very quickly, you don't want it to snap back into place like that. So there are mechanisms in place for allowing the nerve fibers in our brain to fall back into position. And it's those mechanisms that may be compromised in some people and give rise to long-term outcomes from repeated concussions. When the nerve fiber stretches, a whole series of chemical events take place. Ions such as calcium are released from the axon. The little channels on the surface of the axon open up. So sodium comes out of the cell, potassium floods in. And a lot of energy is required to restore the equilibrium of those axons.
So we describe concussion as a brain injury. It happens when a force is applied to the brain. And what you feel as a player or what you see depends on which bit of the brain has been involved. So if it's the base of your brain, which is responsible for consciousness, it may be that you see a player lose consciousness, but that's less than 10% of cases. If it's the balance bit of the brain, it may be that you see a player stumble or be unsteady or not be able to get to their feet. Equally, it can be subtle. The player may develop a headache, feel sick. If it's the memory or thinking bit of the brain, they may not remember the next play. So this is the real challenge with concussion recognition, is that sometimes it's obvious, loss of consciousness, unsteadiness, or a convulsion. Sometimes what you see happens within the first few seconds and then goes. Sometimes what you see develops over 12 to 24 hours and may be as subtle as a player not sleeping well or feeling a little bit more emotional than normal.
The recognition of the concussion is difficult. I mean, everybody thinks they know what a concussion is. I'm still not certain at this stage of my life how to define a concussion. We know that it's transient. We know that it's brought about by impact, rapid acceleration or rapid deceleration, during which the head may or may not be impacted. But we're not good at saying when the concussion is over or when the player is really back to normal? And that's very, very difficult to ascertain.
I think the trouble with the sport of rugby is that the head is, by the nature of the sport, quite exposed. The players are often head down in a number of the different activities in rugby, such as rucking and scrumming, running with the ball, tackling, and their head's often the battering ram. Secondly, I think that rugby players often are running very fast, so there's quite a high energy factor in terms of the both the weight and strength of the rugby players and the speed they're running. And so you've got these two things. You've got the head in the wrong place, and you've got the energy that causes the head injury, which both combine to produce not a very good mix in terms of the possibility of head injury and potentially quite severe head injuries.
Concussion's a different injury to all other injuries, partly because the long-term consequences are still unclear, but also because all of us are our brains, and therefore any injury that potentially might adversely affect the brain needs to be seen and treated differently. Within the professional game, the union works very closely with Premiership Rugby and the Rugby Players Association. And one of the hallmarks of the way we've approached concussion in the professional game is a very joined up, integrated approach between league, Players Association and union.
Knowing when you're concussed, you right away you don't feel normal. You feel kind of dazed. For me, it's always a kind of a ringing, and I feel kind of cloudy, a ringing in my head, and you don't feel right. So in terms of knowing when you're concussed, it's normally after a serious impact. You kind of take account of yourself, and very, very quickly you realize that not everything's okay.
Some injuries are terrible and can be, career enders and stuff. But I think with concussion, when it goes wrong, it can go really wrong. And I think, guys that retire early often have the effects of that for a long time.
My first ever one was when I was 16, and I remember the doctor saying, I think he's been concussed, but I think he's broke his nose as well. And my father turned to him and goes, nah, his nose has always been that bad. Easiest way to explain it is night out, have a lot of drinks, and you've had too many, and next thing you know, you wake up in bed and you just can't remember anything, and you just feel confused and everything about what's happened, and that's the best way to explain it.
So the real big issue with concussion then is, can we say for certain that if you have multiple concussions over your playing career, that in 40 or 50 years, you're going to end up with this entity that we refer to as chronic traumatic encephalopathy? So
CTE is a pathological finding that was found in the brains of sportsmen who have subsequently gone on and died. And before they've died, they've clearly shown signs of dementia. And the first findings were seen in American football players. And there's a series of pathological cases where brains have been looked at. And the key aspect of it is the changes of CTE are very similar to the sort of changes you see in patients who've had Alzheimer's disease, which is another cause of dementia. The great difficulty is that the samples so far are very small. It is not clear whether repeated head injuries cause CTA. What is the nature of the head injuries? Do they have to be of a certain threshold, or do you need to have an impact that knocks you out? These things are really not known.
Seeing the different stories around CTE, around early onset Alzheimer's and what have you, and in other sports, it's definitely it's a scary prospect, because every once in a while I kind of you see something, or you forget something, and you kind of think, is it because of that, or is it because I'm maybe a bit tired, or maybe because I actually did forget? It's definitely worrying. It's more worrying, obviously, for my wife, because she's we love each other, and we want the best for both of us. And she's been a part of my career as a player, and she's seen everything, all the injuries I've gone through. So you know, we'll see what happens in the future. But you know, who knows? Who knows?
A number of guys who were sort of my sort of age, who were in the early days of the professional game, would often talk to me about the reality of being a professional rugby player, as opposed to perhaps the kind of slightly more PR-driven, glossy image of a rugby player that some of the marketing people might like to present life as a professional. And I was sort of getting a probably pretty good picture of the day-to-day kind of grind of being a player and the risks associated with it. And I remember I got a tip-off essentially from a player at Wasps in about 2013, because a young guy called Nick Berry, who's this Australian scrum half who's about 27 at the time, retired because of multiple head injuries. And I made contact with Nick, and he invited me to his house, and I went over there on the Friday night, and his wife was there, and she said to me a line which has stayed with me all the way through. It actually puts goosebumps on the back of my neck now just talking about it. But she said, by the time Nick finished playing, the only thing she cared about at the end of a match was not whether he'd won or lost, but it's whether he was conscious. And she then described in a lot of detail about this lovely, calm, kind, level-headed guy, not a sort of violent streak in his body, would turn into kind of a different person when he went home after being knocked unconscious. And she didn't recognise the man that he became in those times. He had to be shut in a darkened room with no lights on. He had mood swings. He got upset, was volatile. You know, suffered some really intense post-concussion symptoms, which I really didn't understand.
You know, I'd considered Nick a close friend, and just to see that he actually, you know, the pressures on him to really, to, as I say, to not to be open about, his struggles and to hide those struggles in a professional context, really hit me in a hard way. And I thought, geez, you know, if that's someone that I thought was close to me, you know, can't open up to, you know, about those sorts of things, how many more rugby players are out there, you know, going through the same thing?
Yeah, head injuries is always something I've been aware of throughout my career. Like I said, I suffered my first one when I was fairly young. But the culture's changed, so I've become more aware of my head injuries the older I got. And what I found with concussion was the more you had, the easier the next one comes. And I just found every concussion took longer to recover from. To a point where really I was just never recovering at all. And that's when I sort of hit the era I am now and I had to retire.
I've been concussed a few times throughout my career, and the first couple of times were probably just club games and you're aware of it, you're not aware of it. And my first most significant one was in 2010. It was against England. It was in a World Cup, and I was very aware that I was concussed, but at that time there wasn't a lot of information or knowledge about it. I'm a physio, I should know better. I got concussed in the first game of the World Cup, and I was aware that if I had spoken about it, I would have been ruled out for the rest of the campaign, so I didn't. It was a mild concussion, but I definitely was affected in that game. I didn't get many concussions after that, but my next big concussion was actually against England again, so common theme, whether I'm going harder or they're going harder, I'm not too sure.
Yes, I got concussions. I remember the first concussion I got was playing for the UCD under-21s. I got a bad bang in the head, got knocked out and was taken straight off the pitch, and that was it. The coaches at the time, there was no consideration. I was a young player. They took me off the pitch and there was no chance of me going back on. I had a few incidents like that over my career, not too many, thankfully, but the fact is I had never considered it an issue because I always bounced back from it. I never had any symptoms. I always felt good, and for me, I treated it like any other injury. I waited until I felt good again. I applied the return to play protocols with the coaching staff, and I got back on the field and I played rugby again, and I forgot about it. That changed in 2014 when I picked up an injury, a concussion away to Treviso. I got an elbow in the head, from which I never recovered in terms of my ability to take contact. And I never, from that point onwards, felt really comfortable taking contact, which is a real problem when you're a back rower in rugby.
The one I felt triggered me, I got knocked out against Scarlets about 3 years ago. Hit my head in the floor, had to come off straight away. No questions asked, I was off. And then after that, it took me a while to fully recover from that. If it was lines on the floor, I'd feel really ill and sick. I remember going to IKEA and the lines on the floor there, I had to sit down a few times, making my way around there.
I think I was maybe 17, 16, playing for the Worcester first team Premiership game. And I remember being told, run as fast as you can and hit the girl when she catches the kickoff. So I was like, right, run. And so I was running, and I don't think I went low enough or anything. So me and this other girl hit heads, and then I just went flying back, and I was out before I hit the floor. The coach turned and just went, because there wasn't any awareness of concussion then, so I was knocked out, came around and he went, can you play on? Luckily my mum was watching actually that game, and she went, she's not playing on. And and I was very keen, so I threw up, went to A&E, everything like that. They said concussion, and the next day I felt absolutely fine. And I was like, I want to play next week, I want to train. I was really keen, and luckily there was a policy back then that it was 3 weeks. So you were definitely out for 3 weeks, and you had to be. And I'm so grateful for that, because I would have 100% have played on Tuesday and been like, yeah, but I'm fine.
I had a head-on-head collision with a guy named Billy Vunipola, who's big number 8 from England. We both arrived in a ruck at the exact same time. Just an accident of play, things that happen all the time in rugby. And I was seriously concussed. But you're a warrior, you got to push through all this stuff. Your semi-final Champions Cup game, you want to be a part of this game because you want to be in the final for the next week in Twickenham. I was taken into the change room. I was stitched back up in my head. The doc realized that during that time I wasn't doing very well. I was I was clearly concussed, so he put me through an HIA-1. He said, no, you're done. It's no good. Go sit down, take your boots off. A few minutes later, he came back in. He said, Jamie, are you okay? I said, well, yeah, I want to go. He said, Seb's no good, my second row partner. Can you come back on? I said, oh yeah, no problem. I did my boot back up and quickly went straight back out, and I finished the game. I don't remember anything from the last 20, 30 minutes of the game. It was pretty much a void. I've got photos in my head, but only because I've seen the game after the fact. It's a real kind of dark space. And we started a full return to play protocol, which was graduated. So as opposed to going day by day, I would do 1 day protocol, 1 day off, 1 day protocol, 1 day off, because we had 15 days before the final. I wanted to play in the final. They wanted me to play in the final. So it was almost a perfect storm of pressure from the doctors, the club, myself, pushing me to get the green light. So game day came, we're playing well. We switch on to defense about 10 minutes in. I make a normal tackle with my shoulder directly on the hip of Chris Massoy, good friend of mine. Nothing about it, just normal tackle, and I fall straight on my ass. Passed my HIA, got allowed back on the field, and continued playing. Second half, I had a head knock with another player where I was cut. I got taken off the field again for blood. During that time, I was being stitched up. I started feeling nauseous, and I started vomiting in the garbage next to the table where I was being stitched up. The doctor went through the HIA, figured everything was fine, let me back on again. So I finished the game, not really remembering what happened again. Going home on the plane after the game, it was like my head was in cotton. I couldn't see very well. Like everything was kind of really cloudy. My head was, for 1 minute pounding, next minute couldn't feel much. Super tired, couldn't sleep. Got home that night, put my head back, closed my eyes, and all I can hear is bees buzzing. And it was like that for about a good week to 10 days. 10 days I managed to sleep maybe 2-3 hours. So I was obviously extremely angry all the time, extremely anxious with the kids. Anytime I hear any noise, I'd be extremely upset. I couldn't deal with harsh light. If I had have known how everything would have evolved after the final, I would have pulled myself out. But unfortunately, I didn't have the education at the time, knowing how much of a risk it was for a second impact syndrome to play in the final in 15 days.
I think there's a danger as sports fans that people watch the game in front of them and believe it's in some way a kind of theatre or it's not real. These guys are machines, they're robots, they're not human beings, but actually they are human beings who've got families and they go home to them, and they're the ones who have to pick up the pieces.
I think as a player, you just want to play, and sometimes there is kind of that denial as well, because you're like, I'm fine, and other people can see that you're not. You know, you've seen the George North film, he's knocked out, he's got to come off. There's no way he can come back on that pitch. Shouldn't come down to the player decision, I don't think. I think that's medical. But on other instances where it's not as obvious, so sometimes a concussion isn't a knockout. A concussion can be something more subtle, and I don't think it's realistic for a medic to be able to, especially at lower levels where there's not all the cameras, focus on every single player, watching every single impact.
Every time a player goes down on the pitch, there's a few things that happen. Firstly, the player wants to play on. Secondly, the coach wants the player to play on. Thirdly, the medic is from the team. He wants the team to win, and he wants to look after the player as well. But it's this massive conflict of interest where everyone wants the player to play on. I think a coach can say, you know, I'll always look after my players. But when the pressure comes on in the heat of a game with 20 minutes to go and you're 3 points up and your best player goes down, are you going to make the right decision? And I think there are some really great examples, and there's one that stands out in my mind. Playing New Zealand against Ireland in the Aviva, not last year, but the year before in November. And CJ Stander got a bang in the head, and you know, he shook it off and tried to play on. And I remember seeing the Irish doctor at the time, Kieran Cosgrave, sprinting onto the pitch and tapping CJ on the shoulder and looking up to him. He's a big man, and saying, CJ, you have to come off. You know, we've got to do HIA. We've got to look after you. CJ trying to push him away, saying, I'll play on. He was practically dragged off the pitch. Now you've got young Irish rugby players all over the world, all over the country and across Europe. Young rugby players just watching this. Ireland's probably toughest player, one of their toughest players, being dragged off the pitch because he got a bang in the head, and because the coaches like Joe and the rest of the medical staff want to look after this person. And I think we need to see that example right across world rugby.
A lot of our Pacific Island players come here with the mindset of providing for their families at home. That's the number one reason for guys to pursue a career here, and a lot of those pressures relate to the concussion debate. We have players a lot of the time who are playing in those lower leagues whose contracts are structured in a way that means that if they don't play, they don't get paid. That's actually detrimental to the sometimes to their own personal health. When guys are struggling to and their families are struggling just to make the breadline, the decision to play through concussion becomes an easy one for them. They're always going to put their families and the short-term benefit of their families before that of deciding not to play because they might have been concussed the week before.
The only pressure that I felt was just me, because my dream was I wanted to play for Wales, and I had an opportunity to try and make the summer tour, and I thought, right, I want to get there. And then it took that time then to realise that I need to sort myself out first. So I think the most pressure was just coming from myself and my ambition to be the best that I can be. So I'd say that would be the most pressure I had.
I think the pressure is there. It's there on both sides. It may be a little bit heavier on the professional side because you've got TV watching, you've got people in the stands, you've got your teammates who you work very hard together with week in, week out to attain a goal. You've got a lot of pressure from coaches, from management, because if you're not performant, you're going to be your job might be on the line. So there's a lot of different pressures professionally, but I think in amateur rugby there's maybe a little bit less, but it's very similar in terms of pressure, because in amateur rugby you've got the same thing. You've got people in the stands, you've got club members, parents, friends, whoever it may be around, wanting you to play well and to win. So there's those pressures. You've got peer pressure from your teammates, from other people in the club, maybe even pressures from the team in front of you, because you want to win. You maybe have old history with some people in front of you, and you want to obviously do your best. So there's definitely a lot of pressure on both sides to obviously get the win. And problem is, through concussion, sometimes those pressures kind of overtake the need for a proper medical decision or just safety of the player.
As far as the concussion goes over the years, I think it's probably been 3 stages, I think. I probably think years ago it was very few and far between, because the game was a very different game then, where there wasn't as much impact and contact, and players weren't as big and strong as they are in the modern game when professionalism came around. And then came the next stage then, where there was more impact and there were probably more concussions happening in the game, but it wasn't really an area that had been highlighted as a concern, and our awareness of people involved in the game at all levels wasn't as it is now. And then I suppose you go back to the recent years, where the impact is probably the same in the last 4 or 5 years than it was probably 7 or 8, 9 years ago, but our awareness of the consequences of concussion and HIA has been risen over the last few years, because the paramount thing of the game is the player safety on the field.
I remember interviewing Lewis Moody right at the beginning of the Mail on Sunday's concussion campaign, and he used to say that brain injuries were literally treated as a joke. They were players would go off on the side of the pitch, and if they didn't know their own name, they couldn't stand up properly, they were vomiting, it was funny. It was seen as a joke, and that's a massive change from where we were as a sport just 5 or 6 years ago. It's not that long ago, to where we are today, where it's seen as a serious injury. Players aren't accused of faking it, or at least not by sensible people. There is still a long way to go, and unquestionably there are still big challenges for the sport, but it's come a long way.
So the RFU has created an education resource called Headcase, which has a wide range of educational materials and educational modules for players, coaches, parents, referees, and healthcare professionals to do. So this is a bespoke concussion education resource that reaches out to the rugby family to make them more aware. Within the professional game, for the last 4 years, we've done a mandatory education session with all of our professional players in the top 2 leagues, all of the coaches, all of the support staff, and all of the referees. As well as education, you need to make sure that the management is right. So we've invested very heavily in making sure that we deliver good management across all levels of the game, but we need to do it particularly well at the professional level of the game, because that's really what drives people's understanding. So we now have real-time video available pitch side to make sure that we can identify players who may have demonstrated fleetingly signs of concussion. We have our off-field head injury assessment. So that's seen the number of players who stay on the field after a concussion drop from 50% to less than 10. So that's a really positive outcome.
So the HIA is a head injury assessment that takes place when either the referee or a member of the medical staff thinks, or the player thinks they've had a concussion, and it's sort of a 10-minute assessment period to check whether you are concussed or not effectively. So it's sort of like the format of the test. I think it's called a SCAT test, and there's different levels that you pass on the pitch side after the game, and then sort of the following days. I think it's sort of like a memory test and a cognitive ability test, and then symptoms. So you're either going to have symptoms like headaches, dizziness, balance problems, or you're going to be cognitively impaired, so you struggle to remember, or you might struggle to put numbers backwards when they're given to you, or there's a load of different tests just to see if you're all there. I mean, some people struggle with numbers anyway, but it's a fairly effective test, because if there's anything glaringly obvious, they kind of spot it.
Yeah, I think it's a useful tool, yeah. Just because one of my concussions I had, out in South Africa, I had it, and then I had to come off the pitch then, and by the time I came off the pitch, that's when it kind of kicked in. That's when I started like losing memory and stuff. So it took a few minutes after the collision, whereas before, if I didn't have to come off the pitch, I would have been fine straight away to speak to the physios, and then I would have deteriorated and I would have still been on the pitch. And then that scares me a little bit, the fact that a few years ago that would have happened.
I have to say my experience is people are listening. I think the culture change is happening. People are aware this isn't something you can ignore anymore. Obviously, instances have meant that people can't but be aware. What you would see as a lawyer in the area is that there's two different kinds of cases that arise. There's the past ones, when we didn't take those steps to enforce it or to make it safer, and there's the ones that are happening now. Ones that are happening now are probably rarer because people are aware now. This is one area I would hope I don't have a lot of big cases. I would much rather go writing, lecturing and talking about it and make sure that I never have to stand up in court on a case like this.
Reading what happened to Ben Robinson in getting a bang on the head in the game and losing his life for it, that really was a moment that really hit home with me, really, and realised, yes, it's hugely important that we eliminate as much as we can and reduce as much as we can the risks that cause concussion, and also that we also deal with it. And if there's any doubt whatsoever that there has been a bang to the head and there's a risk of concussion, that we don't take any second chances, that that medical attention is given immediately, and that player is not allowed to continue the game to sort of risk any further, really. So that's probably what sort of really made it come home to a lot of people, I think, that concussion can cost lives.
My name's Peter Robinson, Benjamin Robinson's dad. I've been involved in rugby from the age of 8. I coached at one stage as well, but I gave up after Ben, after he died. I suppose really expected the broken bones and the dislocated fingers and things. At that time, I wasn't aware of concussion or the dangers of it, or the dangers of getting a second concussion by staying on. Really, there was more than two, but the term second impact really just means you've had a concussion followed by another. It doesn't have to be a major impact, it could be a minor, it could just be by running about, but your brain doesn't have that chance to recover from the first initial concussion. And like I say, initially we were led to believe that it was a one-off incident at the end of the match. But then some of the students came forward and said, we think Ben was knocked out in the first half, and he was treated on the pitch. He had cut his lip, I think somebody said he had got a boot to the mouth, and he was treated for that. He was asked a few questions, and he played on. And then that was off tape. We didn't have that on tape, that one. It had been turned off. But the first major one was in the second half, again, where he collided with the opposite centre. Now, he was putting in the tackle, and initially you think it's a clash of heads, but it's not. It's just like shoulder onto Ben's breast, and he whips forward and goes down, and you can tell he's out by the way he falls. So again, he's down for a minute and a half, and then treated again, asked questions, pulled up, actually hauled up, and he goes back into position. But then we're starting to hear the stories from other players where Ben couldn't remember the last tackle. He went over to the sideline at one stage and was assessed by the PE teacher. And again, the PE teacher couldn't remember that. But Ben approached him, you know, but whatever happened, finger test was done in front of Ben. And so really he was assessed at least 4 times. And in the final minute of the match, a collision, clash of heads, and that was the final one. He didn't recover from that.
The thing about sport generally is you don't have to make it absolutely safe. People understand there are risks in sport. And the law understands there are risks in rugby. And that the game has its own risks intrinsically. So you don't have to make it absolutely safe. The idea that the law says it has to be risk-free is wrong. But what it is that you can't make a game more dangerous than it need be. And if you can make a game safer without affecting the nature of the game, then if you don't, that can be a problem. If you make rules for player safety, you have to enforce them.
You know, we talk about parents, teachers, players, coaches. You know, the ref hadn't heard of SCAT 2, which was in place at that time. And even at the inquest, which was 2 years later, he still hadn't heard of that. So there was opportunities, and I suppose for me, the annoying part is it was preventable. You know, his death was preventable if the message had been out there in black and white for all to be aware. To me, concussion, it's like drip feeding the public. You just have to keep the drip feed going. And if you take your foot off the gas, then tragedies happen. And yeah.
So the future rugby, particularly around this event, I think is positive in that there's a huge awareness of the issue, and there's a huge amount going on with World Rugby and each of the governing bodies to try and do everything they can.
I think that the future will hold a greater focus on concussion prevention. I think we'll see greater involvement from players and game administrators on the efforts to reduce the risk of concussion, informed by the medical evidence. I think we'll see improvement of the recognition tests and possibly objective tests like salivary markers coming to market. And the long-term health consequences piece will become clearer.
People need to be educated around the dangers of concussion, and that when somebody is concussed, that they are taken off the field. And you'll always get those jackasses in the crowd who are going to yell and holler about it. But the majority of people, when they're educated and they understand the risks, they'll understand that somebody's concussed, that they're taken off the field. It all comes down to education.
You know, for me, I think you have to put safety first, I think. Because at the end of the day, you know, you may be on this planet for a long, long time, and then to live with the effects of doing something because you haven't looked after your body or put your health first is for me a risk not taken, really.
What I see happening, hopefully, is as players become more educated, they'll tap themselves out and say, look, I am being irresponsible to continue to play myself, as well as I'm not going to be as effective on the pitch for my team, and I need to tap myself out, as well as that being met by the docs and the medical staff. So I'd hope that kind of dual responsibility will capture most.
We need to be working with our players and actually saying, look, if you refrain from playing now and get your, and allow yourself that recovery time, you're going to be better off in the long term. Your career is going to be potentially be extended.
The two most important things in life are your family and your health. And if you've got those two things, then you can overcome pretty much anything that life will throw up to you.
My personal opinion on it is that the only way we can actually begin to work with players and work with teams to make sure that we're giving the best possible care for our athletes is to create a culture where it's normal for athletes to be honest about their symptoms around concussion. Where it's not a macho thing of going in and saying, I'll shake it off and play it on. It's like a hamstring injury. I got a bang on my head. I'm going to explain exactly what my symptoms were to the doctor and let them make an informed decision.
We just need everybody singing off the same hymn sheet rather than saying it's a rugby problem. You know, it's a public health issue, concussion in sport.
If you want to help people with it, I think offering them support, especially when they're affected by it, is massively important, because when it goes wrong, it goes properly wrong, I think. And that's the only, I think that's the biggest thing that we can do is provide support for people.
If I could start it all over again, I would. Knowing what I've done now with concussion, I'd 100% play it all again. Just the fact that I'm just passionate about sport, and my sport is rugby.
Yeah, I'd definitely let my kids play rugby. Would I want my child to depend on it as as a livelihood? Probably not, because I think that's when the boundaries become blurred. So while I'd love to see my sons playing, growing up and playing rugby, I never want them to be in the scenario that a lot of Pacific Islands are in, where they have to continue playing through concussion, in order to support their families.
That's a good question. Would I let my kids play rugby? How the rugby adapts over the next few years will probably be, a big aspect in my decision regarding that. How I react personally over the next sort of 10 years. But I just believe there's so many positives in rugby that if we can just look after these only very, very few negatives, that rugby can continue on the uphill that it is currently on.
Ben's story isn't a positive story, but it could be. It could be a positive story, and as a fan, I would hate to think he died in vain and something preventable happened again because somebody's afraid to tell a story. And I think rugby, they don't like Ben's story, but he's one of their own.
We're never going to take concussion out of rugby. No one is naive enough to think that that's even worth considering, because it will not happen. But what can happen, and is happening, is that it can be managed much, much better on the field, and players can be removed when there's a risk.
People will always want to play rugby, so we need to get the message out there. And the biggest risk in rugby isn't concussion, it's the mismanagement of it.
If one person on the pitch had an understanding of concussion or been educated about concussion, Ben would have come off the field when he was showing obvious signs of a brain injury and wouldn't have carried on and would still be alive today. And that's a pretty important thing for people to remember when we're talking about concussion, that the result can never be more important than a player's health. And that's something that rugby's grappling with, is addressing, and needs to continue addressing.